Good morning, K&L Home Church. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Happy Easter. It is so great to be alive this Easter day. So much is going on. This is exciting times we live in. I keep getting phone call after phone call, how bad everything is. Well, I don't think things are that bad. I think God's still in control. God knows what's going on. He hasn't missed anything. So there's a virus. How many viruses have we been through? How many wars have we been through? Everything we've been through, God's brought us through. Keep that in mind. Enjoy these times. Don't get the molly grubs. We don't need that. Well, that's a word I use. I'm sorry, Kelly. But I think about, someone said to someone, oh, I had a bad week. Well, think about the week Jesus had when he hung on that cross for us. I think that was a bad week. I've had some pretty bad weeks in my time, but I've never had one like that. And he had us in mind when he chose to go through that. So let's not dwell on our bad weeks. Let's enjoy life and know that our Heavenly Father has everything under control. Let's ask blessing on the message today. Pastor Kelly's got a really good message. I've been listening and commenting, and we've just been enjoying this week getting the message together. Let's go to our Father. Heavenly Father, we ask your blessing on the message today and on our lives. Father God, without you, we're nothing. And Father, we're just so grateful for all you do and who you are in our lives. We love you, we worship you, and we just want to worship you through this message. In Jesus' name, amen. Come on up, Pastor Kelly.
All right. Thank you, dear. Hi, friends. Nope, you don't need to adjust your sets. He is wearing a plain white t-shirt.
I know, it's my fault.
No, it's part of a plan here. We've got a great message today. Been praying about it this week. Finally, I get it. I wanted to be able to show you, the followers of the New Covenant, this Spirit regenerated ministry. How can we understand the Easter story through the New Covenant? And we have been looking at Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 2, and we've been spending a great deal of time there. And earlier this week I put together a proposition statement. I put it out there so that you can kind of see a summary of what we've been teaching. The idea today is that I want you to see the Easter story like they did in the first century. There was a revealing that occurred to the 12 apostles. They were originally told by Jesus himself. In Acts chapter 1, Luke writes about it, and he says, you go to Jerusalem and stay in an upper room and wait. Wait for what? Wait for the promise of the Father. Now, what unfolds at the resurrection is the promise of the Father that was worked through the Son, and we are looking at it through that lens, that new covenant lens. And there was some things that the apostles didn't get until after the fire fell in Acts chapter 2. From that moment forward, you see a completely different understanding, and it was given to us by Peter. Now, Peter's real name is Simon. But remember that. It was back in Matthew chapter 16 that Jesus was asking this question. He said, who do men say that I am? And you know the story. They say, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're a prophet, some say that you're John Baptist resurrected. And then he stops and he asks the question, but who do you say that I am? And Peter stands up and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says something very profound. He says, Peter, he said, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you. Now remember that Jesus himself is standing there in flesh and blood. And he said, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And then he says this, and I say to you that you are Peter, the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail. That statement could not come true until after the resurrection and the upper room experience of the 120. Peter is the one that we've been studying. It is in his sermon from chapter 2 verses 1 through 13. It's just given to us what was the occurrence. But verse 14 through the end of 29, it's all Peter. It's all Jesus building his church. Now, Jesus is referring to the occurrence that has gone on with the 120. I am building my church. My Father is the craftsman. I am the builder. He's the architect. The ideology is in him. I am the one that sews it together, and we talked about that last week. And so what I want you to understand, and we're going to look at another part of Peter's message, and it's not a coincidence, and no, I didn't plan it this way, but in the second part of Peter's message, remember last week we talked about the first people group in his message. The first people group in his message was the men of Judea. And in the men of Judea, he uses what we unpacked as rhema words, because that's the way Luke wrote it. He said, brethren, you hear, men of Judea, you hear, listen to my rhema words. And he used the story in Joel to say these 120 that are speaking an unintelligible sound, they're not drunk, but this is the fulfillment of what Joel wrote. My rhema words you're hearing. We just heard rhema words from the 120, and what was the result? 3,000 people are given hearing. And so the second people group is where we're going to focus today, and you're going to see that, is it a coincidence that it ties into the resurrection? No, it's not a coincidence. Today we are studying the second people group, but you have to understand the resurrection to get it. And we're going to let his words teach us what exactly is it we're supposed to get. What is it about the new covenant that cannot be understood without resurrection? Well, to get to that, Peter uses Psalm 16 to talk to us about what did David write before this. Now, he's already told the people that are listening, the 3,000, he says, men of Judea. Let's unpack first what those 120 were doing. When you are hearing them speaking in tongues, you're not understanding what they're saying, but you know it's the work of God, and that's clear in the scriptures. But then he shifts and he says, now I want to have a message to the men of Israel. Now the men of Israel get the idea, they're all Jews, but now he's going to be kind of like zooming in a little tighter in the teaching, and he's going to be talking to the men of Israel. And I want to get this, so let's walk through some of the pains, because I've got a lot of them. Go to number 2, Josh. You'll see in the second one, this is a proposition statement that I want you to be able to revisit, because as we keep walking from message to message to message to message, you're going to be seeing this proposition statement forming a picture. It's kind of like you ever look at a stereogram, one of those pictures that's a picture inside a picture, where on the outside it just looks like a bunch of painting that doesn't have any meaning to it, but as you stare at it, hidden behind it is a 3D image. That's what's occurring, is there is something hidden behind Acts 1 and 2 that you have to be able to see into the spiritual realm with the spiritual lenses to understand it. And I put this together so that you can kind of walk yourself through it. But let's get caught up on the text. So let's go to number 3, and let me just read to you verses 1 through 13 in Acts chapter 2, because it's in this that Peter's sermon is unpacking. It says, into the day of Pentecost, they were all to be filled together in the same place in person. And it happened. Suddenly, out from heaven, an echo sound, carried per a violent wind, and it filled to completion the whole house where they were sitting. And they perceptually saw tongues being portioned to them as if of fire, and it sat on each one of them. And they were all completely filled by means of Holy Spirit, and they began to speak in other tongues, just as the Spirit was continuously giving to speak away from the sound. But, here's the second people group. But there were residing Jews in Jerusalem, God-fearing men out of all nations under the heaven. But being born, namely the wind sound, the crowd came together, and they were confused because they were hearing them speaking in their own dialect. But they were existimi and amazed, saying, Behold, are not all of these speaking Galileans? And how are we each actively hearing in our own dialect in which we were born? Parthians and Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and Jewish converts, Cretians and Arabians. We hear them speaking in our other tongues the greatness of God. But they were all existimi. And we unpack that word, away from standing. They were beside themselves. They were not using intelligible sound. And they could find no solution, saying to one another, What does God desire this to be? But others were mocking, saying that they are full of new sweet wine. Now, let me just bring up pane 5s because we got a lot to get through today, and I want to keep moving. I want you to look, the first one is Men of Judea. We unpacked that last week, and we unpacked that message, which is from verses 14 through 21, and the emphasis was on 120 speaking rhema words. These are not logos words, they're rhema words. And they got this teaching out of Joel chapter 2, verses 28 through 32, ending in the idea of calling on the name of the Lord. So today we're going to look at the second people group. If you need to catch up, they're on our website or on our Facebook page. These messages are on our YouTube channel. You can go back and listen to them, and I encourage you to do that. But today we're going to be looking at verses 22 through 28, and you're going to see that it's in his dialogue to the men of Israel that you're going to understand the resurrection story, and you're going to be able to say, okay, I get it. In that, you say, you hear, he says to them in verse 22, men, Israelites, you hear logos words. Now, to the men of Judea, he was saying, hear my rhema words. And to this group, he's saying, men, Israelites, you hear these logos words. And logos words are different than rhema words, and we're going to show you that today. Jesus the Nazarene, a man having been shown as proof away from God for you in power and omens and signs. Now, in today's teaching, we're going to be emphasizing the eternal Logos words. We're going to come across part of this, and it's going to say a horizon plan. And we're going to unpack, instead of Joel chapter 2, we're going to understand Logos words' distinction from Rhema words as we understand Peter's use of Psalm 16, verses 8 through 11. And we know that David wrote the Psalms. So here's the idea. Now you can come back to me for a second. Here's the idea. In the first 13 verses, you see this occurrence, and it happened. We got, in our previous teachings, we unpacked, we said, okay, we've got certain people that are speaking. We have 120 people that are in an upper room, and they are speaking in an unintelligible sound. But inside the city of Jerusalem, we have the second people group, which we just called them the hearers. Now, they are the ones that are saying, we hear the greatness of God. If they hear it. Now, there is a distinction that they're hearing, and we unpacked that last week because it's Peter that stands up and says, I'm going to tell you everything that you are hearing, but in order to get you to understand what has just happened in those 13 verses, I'm just like a preacher. He would say, I need you to turn to Joel chapter number 2 so I can explain to you what does Rhema words do that these 120 just spoke. I need you to see that this is God pouring out his Spirit, and people are speaking. They're prophesying. I need you to understand Rhema words, and I'm going to show you that in Joel's teaching. But now he's at a part where he's now talking to people that he says men, Israelites. And there is a teaching that he is associating with that, but to teach that part, he's saying, now flip your Bibles open, so to speak, to Psalm number 16. And that's where we're going to look at the Greek text today of Psalm 16. Well, actually, Acts chapter 2, verses 22 to 28, which cites Psalm 16. Does that make sense? So we're letting Peter, and you're going to say, you know, it's kind of interesting. Why does Peter have this front stage? Why is he front and center? Well, part of it has to do with what we said earlier. Jesus pointed to him. His name is Simon. Remember, his name, Petros, means rock. And Jesus is the one that says, I am saying, you have been known as Simon. My Father has revealed something to Simon, the Jew. The Jewish Israelite connection is seen through Simon. But then he says, but I am going to build on that, and I'm going to build on calling you Rock, Peter. So don't let that lead, because Peter is now the spokesman, and he's the one that says, okay, I'm going to unpack what's happening. How is it that you're hearing when these people are praying in an unintelligible, and it's clear? You cannot deny that they're speaking in tongues, because they're being accused of being drunk. And the word that says the Spirit gave them utterance clearly in Greek is apa and thangomai. Apa means to be separate from. And thangomai is sound, any sound, doors creaking, owls hooting, books falling, thunder cracking, any sound. But what is the only sound that we see? The echo. So what is Luke writing? It's away from that echo that's clearly leaving heaven, there's a sound arriving, and these people are raising their voices, and they are repeating the echo. You know, when you speak into a canyon, you first have to, hey, and then you wait. It hits the rocks in the canyon and echoes the sound back. Hey, you hear it back. Well, that's what is going on here. From heaven, Jesus is seated, and he's speaking the commands of God, and they are coming into this, and these people are echoing it into the created order. That's what is happening. And it's Peter that says, in order for you to understand that, we have to let Joel speak. But now he turns to these 3,000 that are clearly perplexed. They're talking amongst each other, and they're saying, we hear the sound of the greatness of God, but as they're talking to each other, they're unable to make the connection. They clearly says, we don't know what God means for this whole thing that's unpacked. We don't know what to do with it. Now, since we've already read through the entire chapter, we know that they're going to finally turn after Peter's speech. And they're going to be cut to the heart after Peter unpacks Joel and he unpacks Psalm 16. These men are going to look to them, and then we're going to be introduced to the third people group, which is the same ones, but now they're going to be returning to the 12, and they're going to say, brothers, what do we do? And it's so important that you see that the confusion is brought into clarity because Peter, the rock, is giving the clarity. Just as Jesus said, Peter, through you, I'm going to build my church. Through this concept that he's unpacking. Now, Peter's not going to be around forever, so Jesus is going to say, when I start speaking from heaven and 120 start speaking in tongues, there's going to be an immediate resistance. And after you teach, people are going to understand this moving forward. And that pattern of people speaking in tongues and people hearing is going to be the method moving forward forever. That I'm going to draw people out of the world to myself. I'm going to be bringing judgment against the kingdom of darkness. And this is how I'm going to build the church. And you are going to be the spokesman first. And he's still doing it today. So let's get into the text now. Look at the sixth pane. And I'm going to read my translation at the bottom. And I'm going to make comments throughout this. But remember, we're now looking at the context of the Logos word. Men, Israelites, you hear the Logos words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man having been shown as proof away from God for you in power, omens, and signs. Let's keep reading because we're going to have to keep moving. Pane number 7. In which God did through him in your presence, just as you men yourself experientially know. Now he uses an oida word here. Now come to me just for a second. Let me explain something to you. If we were there, it would have been very common for us to look at each other and say, well, no, we really don't have the experience. How is it that he is saying that God did this thing through him and we have some kind of experience that we know? Here's what Peter is saying. They are followers of Torah. Now, they have seen this before. They've read it before. They've just not had the right lens to understand what they read in the New Spirit administration. What is Peter pointing at? He's saying this, and I'm going to show you later at the end of the message. He's telling them that when Moses, who you all have experience in knowing, when he was interacting with God in the tent of meeting, you've seen this same pattern before. You've seen this face-to-face encounter like the 120. But you've seen it through Moses, because Moses would go to this tent outside the camp and he would talk with God. And then he would bring the word to the people. And you've seen it before, you've read it in the Torah, but you've not made the connection. And he's saying today that comes to an end. Today I'm going to show you that you have seen this before. You've read the Old Testament, but you've not made the connection. He said, I'm going to show you that today. Now let's look at slide number 8. And here's where he starts to put the hammer to the rock. He said, this man, Jesus, in the horizon plan. Now, cock your head like this, because that's kind of a weird word. And foreknowledge of God, you executed, nailing him to the cross, given out by the hands of lawless pagans. Now, this is what he's saying. Go ahead and bring it to me for a second. Here's what he's saying. You are a Jew. You are in a covenant with Moses. This new spirit administration is up and running, but there was people that weren't in any covenant at all that Jesus was handed over to. Pagans put him to death. The influence of Satan is behind their actions. Not the Jews. Remember, they turned him over to the Romans. And this is what he's saying. Now, last week, this is where you have to understand the last week's message with the sewing aspect. You remember when we did the knitting? This is what he's saying now. He's building. Remember, he's already said that. So in our teaching, we've had last week's lesson, now this week's lesson, in his sermon, which I don't question at all, was probably hours long. This was something that he had been building all the way through. We've just broke it up in, to the 120, now the 3,000. But in the original, if we could have been there, it was all happening at one time. And we used the writer of Hebrews to teach us about faith. And I want to revisit that just for a second, read that text so you can understand, what does the horizon plan have to do with what you're saying. Now, the NASB says it this way. This man, Jesus, he's speaking of Jesus, delivered over by the predetermined plan. I used horizon plan because the Greek word comes from the word horizo, which we get the word horizon. And they say it's a predetermined plan. And the idea behind the Greek is like when the sun is coming up on the horizon, something brand new is breaking forward. That's what he's showing here. He says, let me quote Hebrews 11. He says, in faith, we give thought to string together, and that's where we did the sewing, to knit together the eternal ages in Rhema words. The 120 are speaking Rhema, and we did this last week. As they're speaking, there is a knitting that's going on. A knitting. That is the spoken Rhema words, and it's happening right here. The eternal ages in Rhema words sourced by God. Then he finishes the thought saying this, for the visibly seen is not the visibly seen being born from the shining. And we unpack that. This is what the writer's saying. This world that you see is carrying in an infection. It's not the original perfection that was leaving the mouth of God. So, just like a movie a producer would be looking at this clip, and he's kind of splicing them together to make a motion picture seamless. This is what he's saying, that God is unpacking an eternal plan through speaking, that Jesus is sowing Rhema words. These are being sewn together. Why? Because the original plan is still being put together. That's what he's saying. And Now you see what he's saying to the Israelites, to the you men of Israel. Now you hear logos words. Now this is why this is so important to understand the horizoning plan. The logos words is what he's still building, Lisa, on that knitting from the Rhema. What he's now saying is this was a plan, a predetermined plan by the Father, that what is occurring, that is the 120 is knitting. Now he's backing it up and he's saying now you have to understand the distinction between the 120 that we're knitting, but what they're knitting together finds its source in the heavenly realm of God. And here's what he's saying so you understand. He's saying that in the predetermined horizon plan, God has done this in advance, and here's how it's working. He's saying that God the Father has given, like Jesus is saying, okay, here is one thread. This horizon plan is best understood this way, that here is the thread. Jesus has got all these threads, and he's coming up there, and here's how he's putting it together. Okay, these 120 are speaking, but Jesus is the one going, this is the thread for my Father. Okay, it's time for this one, and these guys are speaking, and he's saying, let's put the red thread together. This is the Logos, the eternal thread is in heaven. And he's saying that these guys are putting this eternal plan. I'll speak it, and they'll start sewing it, but the thread is the eternal word of my Father. I assemble it. We're going to knit it down there, but I'm going to assemble it. It's now time for this thread. Let those 120 speak. And they're speaking. And then he goes, okay, now it's time for this thread. And they're going to speak. Now it's time for this thread. This is the horizon, the eternal plan that originates in heaven. So the thread is the Logos word that is being sown as Rhema. But each individual thread is being given from the Father. Israelites understand that this is how it's going, and it's coming from the eternal realm of heaven downward into the Rhema world where it's going to be knit together. Now, there's things in the scripture that's pointed to this, and you've really just not made the connection in time. When you read of Joseph's coat of many colors, this is the idea behind it. When you read of Samuel's mother knitting together a coat and taking it to him, this is what this is pointing to. And in John chapter number 19, listen to these words so you get a better understanding. The soldiers that nailed Jesus to the cross, it says that they bring out the clothing of Jesus and they tear it in parts amongst themselves. But John chapter 19 verse 23 says this, then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took the outer garment and made 4 parts, a part to every soldier, and also the undergarment, the part that touched his skin. That's the reason I'm wearing this. The undergarment. Now the undergarment was seamless, woven from the top down into one piece. This they did not tear. Now this is what this is all pointing to in Acts chapter number 2. There is 120 seamstresses in an upper room. They're knitting together, but the yarn is the eternal Logos word that makes the garment. And it starts at the top all the way down, and it's the covering. Now, Paul would mention that same thing when he talks about the armor of God. When he's talking about the armor of God, believe it or not, church, he's talking about Acts chapter 2 of the 120. They're putting on the armor. They're putting on this belt. As you start at the top, but Paul, remember in Ephesians, he says, but above all, put on the helmet of salvation. This is the mind. This is getting the mind of Christ. The 120 are speaking because the mind of Christ is controlling them. They're doing the knitting, but the pattern, the sewing, is coming from the Father's plan. This is the whole idea that's being given to us in the horizon plan of Logos words. Now, this plan is of no value at all to the flesh. This is where he says, now let's look at David so you understand this. Now look at pane number 9. Whom God, well, let me see if I got number 8. Okay, let me just stay on 9 for a second. This man, Jesus, in the horizon plan and foreknowledge of God, you executed, nailing him to the cross, given out by the hands of lawless pagans. Then he says, whom God, having stood up, removed the torture of the death, and because it was have no power to prevail him who was temporarily under it. Now go to slide 10. For David says to him, and here's where he says, now we have to look at Psalm 16 so you can understand the plan has no value at all as long as death is occurring. If Jesus Christ remains dead, the horizon plan stops. And then he points to David, and here's what he says. I was continuously seeing the Lord in front of me. By all that out from the right side, he is in order that I might not be shaken. Now come to me just for a second. I don't want to miss out on this. He's bringing David in. And here's what they would have understood. The NASB says, for David says of him, I saw the Lord always in my presence, for he is at my right hand, so I will not be shaken. David understood. I'm role-playing. God has said to me, there's somebody from my lineage that's going to sit on this throne forever. And he's saying that David's 16th Psalm is an understanding that David got, that there is this idea that's in my reigning, that God is doing something beyond my comprehension, that the Lord and the pattern of lordship through a king is ever before me. It's right here in front of me the whole time. And he keeps unpacking this, and he says, by this my heart was made glad, and my tongue was joyful. But still also my flesh will dwell in anticipation. Now, in my slides, I brought out the passive in the middle and the future, because here's what David is saying in this. He said, but my heart, this revelation inside me, it was given. There was an investment internally that played out in a joyful tongue. Do you see the correlation to Acts chapter 2? He said, and my tongue was joyful. But then you can almost kind of hear him pause. He said, but still there's this problem with my flesh. There is an exchange, there's an infusion of faith in my heart. This is what the 3,000 are saying. I understand this deposit that has caused me to hear the greatness of God. But there's a perplexity that David is introducing into Psalm 16. And it's here that Peter is saying this role-playing perplexity that David is saying, there is still something that I don't get because I'm still in this body. There's something about it that's just puzzling. And we keep reading in the 12th pane. He says, but you. Now David, he's quoting Psalm here. But you will not abandon my soul into Hades, neither will you give your Holy One to perceive or see through corruption or rotting flesh. Keep reading. Verse number 13. You make known to me the pathway of life. You will fill me to completion, possessing euphoria in the company with your face. Now, I'm going to bring this together here. Here's what he is saying. Peter is using David's psalm to say there is a model of an eternal king that was given to David, that there's going to be one who sits on the throne forever. And David has clearly made a connection in part. There's a heart thing here that's joyful, and it's making my tongue glad with euphoria. But I don't know where this is leading because I'm still in this flesh. I'm puzzled where this is all leading. And then he says, but you're making something known unto me of the pathway of life, and you're filling me to a euphoria with this face-to-face exchange, but it's not given to me in its entirety. Peter is using this to say now it is given to us in the entirety. What David was pointing at is that the revelation could not be understood, and God would not fulfill the entirety of the revelation as long as Jesus was in flesh. When he died, he was saying the Father's horizon plan of speaking and sowing, the Logos and the eternal, the covering that is being woven, this plan of God that is being woven from the top down, it has a limitation and a restriction that only dying in the flesh will reveal. And this is what he is saying, that the brakes are on as long as the rotting flesh is in play. This is what Moses never understood, that the revelation of this face-to-face encounter cannot occur until resurrection. This is what he is saying. He's saying, you've made known to me the pathway of life. And Peter is using that, saying, the 120 are showing you that outside of rotting flesh, believe it or not, that's what aging is. When you're not aging, you're rotting. You really are. The body is molding and rotting. It's decaying little by little, day by day. And he's saying that when that has played out and these 120 are stepping out as they were instructed, God can then use that and start knitting together his plan through people that have presented their bodies as a living sacrifice. And this is what Peter is teaching. He taught us about the knitting of the Rhema through the men of Judea speech. But now through the Israelite section, he's teaching us, but the thread count is coming from the Logos word. And it's being put together, and it's been a plan, and it's always been under the outer garment of Jesus. It's always been there. We've just not ever been able to see it because of this rotting flesh. Now flip to pane number 15. Now I want you to see this in Exodus. And you'll see one. 45, okay. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, a good distance from the camp. And Moses called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. This is a separate thing from the Mosaic covenant. This is pointing to where we're at in this upper room. It's outside the covenant of Moses. And it came about whenever Moses went out to the tent that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. Next slide. Now, whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and worship, each at the entrance of his tent. Thus the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Now this is pointing to the exchange. Moses, you can't go into the new land. You can't go into the place where the new covenant is, but Joshua, whose name in Hebrew is the same as Jesus, Yeshua, but he can. He can go into the next place. And you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore I pray, if I have found favor in your sight, let me know your ways, that I may know you, so that I might find favor in your sight. Consider too, this is the nation, and it's your people. Now listen what God responds to that. And God says, my presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest. Then he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not lead us up from here. For how then can it be known that I have found favor in your sight and your people? Is it not by your going with us, so that I and your people, may be distinguished from all the people upon the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I've known you by name. Then Moses says, and I've underlined it, show me the shining, doxa, show me the glory, show me what's missing. What is it that you're hiding from me? There is something that I don't see. Now that's what Peter's talking about. Peter is pointing and saying there's a limitation that you can't get to without resurrection. The 120 have died to themselves and they've stepped into the end purpose for faith. They're sowing the rhema words of God that are originating with the Logos. They're sowing it, but Moses, you can't. And that limitation's still here today. As long as you're willing to stay in this rotting flesh, you cannot step into this end purpose. Look at pane 19. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. Moses, this covenant's moving forward. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. You see the 3,000. That's exactly what it is. It is the three. He's saying, Moses, I will give faith to whomever I darn well please. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. And I will show. Now he's not showing. He's showing compassion to the 120. I will be grace to those whom I will be. 3,000, you are getting the deposit of grace, but you're perplexed by it. But I will show. That's the exact word Paul uses in Romans 12. Inner mercies of God is the word compassion right here. By the inner mercies of God, present your body. This is what he's saying to Moses. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. Then the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand there on the rock. Now, I know we're all taught this is pointing, the Father's pointing to Jesus. I'm not going to deny that, but I'm going to say it this way. That's Peter. Beside me is Peter. This is why Peter's name is Peter, from Simon. Simon, beside me is this rock. And it will come about while my glory is passing by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you, and with my hand until I've passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back. But Moses, you cannot see my face. You cannot see my face. And remember that. And go to the very last slide. It's my ending slide. Finally, I get it. And this is what I wrote in here in my notes. Why was it? You ever ask that question? Why is it that after raising the dead, walking on water, cleansing lepers, turning water into wine, miracle after miracle, demons are being chased out of people? This man is incredible. Why is it that after he says to these people, I'm going to be turned over, I'm going to be nailed to a cross, but in 3 days I'm coming out of the grave, why is it that no one's standing there when the stones rolled away? Have you ever asked that question? Why is it? They would have died instantly. If he would have came out of that and they would have seen his face in their flesh, boom, dead. Here's what the revelation is. He was withholding that until he gets this revelation fully unpacked. Remember, for 40 days he's showing himself, but they're not understand that he walks with people on the road to Emmaus. They don't know it's him. The two women are talking to him at the grave. They don't recognize him. Why? Because this revelation is reserved until he gets this resurrection part of the plan of God fully sewn together. And you'll see the distinction between the body of Moses and the face. You have to see the difference. And where do you see it? John teaches us. And I'll read it to you and I'll close. Remember, the horizon plan is what's being unfolded. It's the empty tomb, John chapter 20, verses 1 through 7. And you'll see it very clearly. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark. Now get that. And saw the stone already away from the tomb. The hand of the Lord is away from Moses' face right here. So she ran and came to Simon Peter. There's both his names, Simon, Hebrew, Peter, the rock. And to the other disciples whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him. Now get this. So Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. The two were running together, and the other disciple ran faster than Peter and came to the tomb first. And stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. That's the shroud around the body of Jesus. That's the near purpose of this new covenant. And so Simon Peter also came following him, and he entered in to the deadness, to the tomb. And he saw the linen wrap as well, and the face cloth, which had been on the head of Jesus, not lying with the linen wrapping, but rolled up in a place all by itself. Now come back to me for a second. This is I hope you see this, that the idea of the woven garment is God was weaving this together, but he didn't get all the way to the bottom where the covering was until the resurrection was understood. That the completion of the resurrection is a reservation for those that have died to themselves. They're not just looking into it and seeing the burial place. They're entering into the death of Jesus. And they're seeing the distinction of that which was covering the face. They're seeing it. Moses, you cannot see it and live. This is what Peter is teaching in Acts chapter number 2. The Rhema words are the 120 that's knitting, but they're getting the thread from the Logos. And the revelation is not complete with people just speaking. You have to be taught why they're speaking, and you can't get it until you understand that only by dying to yourself and entering into that death and being resurrected will you be able to be used by God to speak the Rhema. And Peter is the one that is the rock in Exodus 33. Beside me, there is a rock. And I've got to put my hand over your eyes until I go past it so you don't perceive. You cannot put this together in the theater of your rotting flesh. This is a revelation that occurs only to those that will enter into the death. They will see truly the body. They'll understand the faith of the broken body, but they will go even further to the end purpose where they'll see the face that was wrapped. It's in a separate place. Moses, you can't see it. But for those people, and that's what this entire ministry is all about, because the Bible's been heading there. The entire reason Jesus was born, the entire reason was because all the way back in Genesis, God started a knitting pattern for the clothing that would be incomplete without the death, the burial, the resurrection, but the invitation to enter into that. That's where the face-to-face encounter is occurring for the 120. And in that is where Peter's next teaching lesson goes. He's finished now with Judea. You understand Rhema, the knitting. Now you understand Logos, the thread. Now he's going to wrap up his sermon, and we will next week, when he says, now that you understand it, my final teaching point is from brethren to brethren. Because they're finally going to listen, as he says that, they're going to say, the Bible said they're cut to the heart. And they said, brothers, what do we do? Now, most people have been taught that cut to the heart is when they hear that they nailed him to the cross. No, no, no. That's not it. What's cutting them to the heart is the revelation that there's something they're supposed to do now that they've been given faith to believe. There's a burning. What's next? That's what's in Moses' heart. I know there's more than this. Show me the shining. Show it to me. I want to see it. That's where we're going to end up next week. For this Easter, I would like to thank everybody for what you do. I know that we are a teaching ministry, and I know we require that you really study and you think. I really appreciate that. It keeps me going to put these things together, because it's not enough. It wasn't enough then to just think this is on autopilot. If it was just an automatic thing, Peter would have never stood up and started teaching. This teaching ministry originated right here in Acts chapter 2. Because it says, after this, you're not going to see him say, and Peter takes some and they start building these massive mega churches. No, you're going to see the pattern then was they would start going from house to house, teaching about what this new covenant means. And that's why God said, Kelly, start this. Lisa, open your home. Get this teaching back to where it was, because people are never going to understand the face cloth. They're always going to be trying to figure this out in the theater of their rotten soul. And it's going to remain hidden as long as they're trying to use the rotten soul. This is never going to be understood until they understand what does it mean to die and to be resurrected. That's what this is about. We love you. We'll see you next week.